Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. I'm Dan Hurley. Recently, the Hamilton County Tax Levy Review Committee submitted midterm reports to the county commissioners about the status of 3 levies. Their reports covered the Developmental Disabilities Levy, the Cincinnati Museum Center Operating Levy, and the Family Services and Treatment Levy. To discuss these reports, which were prepared by the subcommittees of 3 people, I am joined by Tom Cooney, the chair of the Tax Levy Review Committee. Mr. Cooney is a founding partner and the president of Cooney Faulkner and Stevens. Tom, welcome back to Newsmakers.
Well, thanks for having me, Dan.
Let's just remind people, what's sort of the responsibility of the Tax Levy Review Committee, and particularly in terms of these midterm reports, as opposed to taking a look at proposals for what might be on the ballot in the fall or whenever?
Right. Well, when we do a report on a full levy when it's coming up for election, we actually hire consultants and go very in depth into the operations of the agencies that are utilizing the levy funds. When we do midterm reports, it's much less of a review. We just use our volunteer committee members and really just get an update on the agencies, how they're spending the funds, you know, what's changed in their circumstances and really on the tax levy circumstances, and what they should be alert for when it comes time to renew the levy.
You do have recommendations, and we'll get to some of these. Can the committee, you submit all these reports to the commissioners. It's the commissioners who have the power. The committee doesn't have the power.
That's
right?
absolutely correct. We're just an advisory committee. They can take our advice and you know, do with it what they want.
Can they make changes midterm through a levy, though? Or is that something that this is really looking ahead to a renewal possibly in a couple of years?
Well, when a levy passes, then there's a contract, a legal contract negotiated with the agency. So as long as they conform to that contract, they really can't make changes. Okay. What often happens, and what's happened in recent years, is the amount that the levy generates has been reduced because property values have gone down.
Okay. And therefore, something has to happen to reduce the, the services that are provided.
That's right. There's just not enough funding. Well,
let's take a look at one of these in particular, the Developmental Disabilities Levy. And we have some basic statistics about this. It passed in 2009. 3.62 mils was a renewal, and then a 0.51 mil increase. Reduced the budget, and this is reflective of what you were just talking about, reduced amount of money available. They're in the process of reducing their budget to the agencies covered by this from $113 million in 2012 projected to $103, so taking $10 million out of those budgets, and a reduction of 46 plus positions since 2005. So you sort of reviewed that. A theme, especially in this one and in the Family Service and Treatment Levy, is the reduction of the amount of money available, not only because of the lessening of property values, but also because the state has changed its contributions.
Well, that's correct. Most of these agencies, we like to think of the county levy as a funder of last resort. So most of these levies also receive funds from either the federal government, the state government, or a combination. And they're getting squeezed on all those fronts, not just our local funds.
Is the mandate to your committee from the commissioners, is it to, what is it? Is it to squeeze things to the lowest level possible? Is there been a case where the Tax Levy Review Committee has said, this particular area, this set of agencies actually needs more money?
Well, sure. Well, we have increased millage for various levies. I think our mandate is to make sure that the funds are used efficiently, so that the agencies operate efficiently, that we are the funder of last resort. So if there's other funds that are available, we want to make sure that they're using those before they use the county dollars.
That you capture those.
Right.
And in the case of developmental disabilities, as they are mandated by state law to deliver a lot of these services. So on the one hand, the state's telling them they have to deliver the services. On the other hand, they significantly cut their income.
That's correct, and really that kind of goes across the board with a lot of these levies that fund social services. There's a requirement that the county provides certain services, but there's no real funding for that mandate beyond the levies.
Okay, so, and in terms of, and I don't know this from reading the report, it might have been there, in something like the Developmental Disabilities Levy, do you know, does the local levy provide more money in absolute terms than the state does?
I don't recall off the top of my head of that particular one.
No problem. Let's take a look at a slightly different levy, and that is the levy that funds operations at Cincinnati Museum Center, which is not a government agency. It is a private organization. This was, in 2009, a renewal of a .18 mil levy. This is the smallest levy in Hamilton County. And one of the things that this report really focuses on was the whole question of financial management and increasing earned income from admissions, from food sales, from parking, and that sort of thing. And then there's a significant part of this report that focused on a commentary about the much talked about need for capital funding, which is not covered in the 2009. That's a small operational levy. So why do you think the subcommittee felt it needed to talk about this other thing, this potential for major repairs of Union Terminal?
Well, there's a couple reasons for that. One, the operating levy is supposed to expire soon, so it's very vital, I think, to the Museum Center to get the funds from the operating levy. But if it expires, then what's their replacement? And that has to be capital endowments of some type. And then secondly, at some point, if they aren't able to raise the funds to do the capital that they need to, you know, how are they going to continue to operate the building?
And this may expire. We talk about renewals all the time. There was initially, when this was on the ballot 2 cycles ago, the suggestion, the promise that this would only be put on the ballot twice and then it would expire.
Correct.
So there's nothing legally to prevent it from being put on the levy, on the ballot again, is there?
That's correct, and I think they are planning on putting a levy on the ballot again sometime in 2014.
On the other side, you brought up this need for private funding, endowment funding. And anybody who's been in the museum world, and I have, and I got a giant conflict of interest. I used to be an assistant VP over at the Museum Center. So maybe I know too much, that's the problem. But does your committee get into I know financial management is something you get into evaluating. Do you get into evaluating the effectiveness of their development operations and whether or not they are effective at raising that private money and therefore somewhat replacing the need for public money?
Well, we do get into it in the sense that we look at the result of the effectiveness, and that's how much they've actually achieved in endowments. Mm-hmm. And really, we have 2 agencies that we look at, 2 levies really, that are not for social services. Right. The Museum Center and the Zoo, which is coming up in this year's election. And to us, there's more of a need for private funding for those because there's more and more pressure on the social services, and you know, there's limited funding.
Mm-hmm. How would you evaluate the ability of those 2 comparison, the zoo's ability to build an endowment versus the museum centers?
I think our committee feels that both need to work harder on building their endowments. I think the zoo has managed to raise a lot more money through contributions, but a lot of that money gets spent on their various capital projects, mm-hmm. as opposed to going into their endowment fund.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a real debate inside the business about, capital spending, capital endowment funding versus capital, raising money for capital. People love to give to brick and mortars. It's hard to convince them to even understand what a general endowment is for.
Well, that's true, and the more brick and mortars you build, the more ultimately you're going to spend to operate it, and right. Those funds are hard to raise too.
In the case of the Museum Center, that was a situation where, well, actually it's technically true in the case of the zoo as well. This is a public building, It's owned by the city. The improvements are owned by the county. So this is a public building, and it is not the most, let's put it simply, the energy efficient building or the building that is easy to maintain. So it's like, here's this private not-for-profit living in a building that's publicly owned that is very difficult to maintain.
Yes, and that's really putting it mildly. I mean, it's actually falling apart, literally, from the beams.
Right, yeah, there's water that flows in, and it's rusting underneath, and that's one of the problems, that $163 million proposal. Much of that work is going to happen beneath the surface. Nobody's ever going to see it, even if it's all done, and it's hard to sell that.
Correct. It's like if your house has all the studs rotting and you decide to replace those studs. Most people wouldn't do that.
Yeah, they don't care. So anyway, let's go on to the Family Services Treatment Levy, and this was a levy that was passed in 2009. In some ways, it's a renewal because a lot of the programs were renewals. It's 0.34, so not a very large levy, but it is used to be part of the Drake. The programs used to be part of the Drake levy, which was much larger. There's been a reduction of state support again, and also the ending of state support for what used to come to Drake Hospital, and then the elimination. And then in this, the committee proposes the elimination of certain programs beyond Talbert House, and we'll get to that in a second, of the drug-free communities and the off-the-streets program. So let's sort of pick at several of these. Most of this funding goes to programs operated by Talbert House, which are trying to reduce the number of people incarcerated.
Correct.
Provide treatment for people with drug and alcohol problems or with mental illness problems who end up in the legal system. So there's a lot of focus on Talbert House in this report. And again, I'm not sure people know just how big Talbert House really is.
It's a very large organization, and a lot of these programs are really jail alternative programs. And if you look at it not so much from a social sense, but from just an economic sense, we save a lot of money if we can keep people out of jail by successfully going through these programs.
By not having to build that new jail.
Correct, correct.
So, so a lot of concern with the reduction of funding for Talbert House programs here, and the squeeze Talbert House finds itself in terms of, and part of that, as I mentioned, was the report proposes the elimination of the funding for certain other programs outside Talbert House. And very honestly, that has caused some real interest and concern. The Off the Streets program run by the Anna Louise Inn for women working their way out of prostitution only gets about $64,000 a year, and in comparison to the Talbert House funding, this is minuscule. Why identify those programs?
The logic was pretty simple. Those programs were not historically part of the levy. They got added in the last cycle because I think they were very good programs. They were already up and running. Mm-hmm. This was just additional funding for them. And I think the logic was we have less funds than we had in 2009. There's more need, and we could probably eliminate those new programs. They would still be around. They're not going to go out of business.
Well, actually, there is a section in the report that says Anna Louise Inn has this other money coming, but that's capital dollars and can't be used for operations, which struck me as a very strange sentence in this report, because it was like, oh, wait a minute, is this a mistake? I mean, there is you can't use capital dollars in operations.
Right. I think the context was they have the ability to raise a lot of money that they could probably withstand a $64,000 cut. It wasn't that they would take their capital funds and use it.
This also raises in my mind another question. It's probably the last one we'll have time for. But do you also get into the question, and I'm not just thinking of Talbert House here, I'm also thinking of the Museum Center, because I happen to know it, of does the committee get into evaluating salary levels in these institutions? So, for example, I'm thinking about it on both ends. On the one end, at the museum center, when I was there, our frontline staff that the public dealt with when they went into one of our museums, college graduates, we were paying them $18,500, eventually $19,500, which is not a livable wage. And then on the other end, the question of where the upper management gets paid. And the same day the Enquirer reported on your report, the Business Courier put out a report that afternoon about the salary level of the CEO of Talbert House. Do you get into looking at those sorts of questions?
Not in the midterm reports, but
okay.
we do when we do our full report as the levies are being renewed. We compare, our consultants really that we hire compare salaries to other similar organizations. We also look at, what their increases have been, compare that to other organizations, as well as, for instance, the county, where most employees have gotten, I think, one raise in the last 6 years.
Right. So what was your reaction when you saw the salary of the CEO at Talbert House?
It wasn't a surprise.
It wasn't a surprise to you?
No.
What do you think of it? Because it's over $600,000.
It's a lot of money. I don't know if that's like distorted because of something that happened, because that's not the same compensation that I had seen before.
Yeah, so I think it was a surprise to a lot of people. So, okay, interesting report. How can people find this for themselves?
Well, it's real easy. Just Google Tax Levy Review Committee and you'll find all our reports. You can find, when we do have meetings, it's an open meeting schedule. That's also online. So if you're interested, it's a volunteer committee. You can submit an application. If you want to do a little work.
You do a lot of work. So thank you, Tom. Thank you for the work you do. Thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you, Dan.
Welcome back. Increasingly, American economists and political scientists are writing about the implications of the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of the top 1 or 2%, the collapse of the middle class, and the loss of jobs that pay a living wage. Addressing those issues in the context of the mainstream economy is problematic. For 2 centuries, reformers have experimented with worker-owned cooperatives as an alternative model. The most successful in the last half-century has developed in the Basque district of Spain and is known as the Mondragon worker-owned cooperatives. Today, 200 co-ops employ 85,000 worker owners, which produce $24 billion in annual sales, making Mondragon the 7th largest corporation in Spain. Now, the Mondragon model has been brought to Cincinnati through an agreement in 2009 with the United Steelworkers. One of the 5 initiatives of the local co-op is called Our Harvest. Here's a portion of a video on that project that can be found on YouTube.
In Ohio, we spend $29 billion every year in food. Only $3 billion of those $29 billion is spent on food that is produced within our state. If we shift only 5% of this, we will be able to create 32,000 family-sustaining jobs in our state. Our Harvest is a worker-owned food hub cooperative.
We're aggregating and distributing local produce, helping them get up to scale so they can get past kind of the farmers market level, so that they can go and supply produce to the institutions, to schools, universities, hospitals. But the only way they're going to be able to do it is by working together, and that's what the Food Hub does. One of the most exciting things about the Our Harvest Cooperative is the model that we're based on, which is the Mondragon Cooperative. Mondragon is the most successful worker cooperative in the entire world, based in Spain, and started over 56 years ago with 5 worker owners, and now has over 85,000 worker owners in over 200 cooperatives. And it just totally recreated the middle class and the working class in this area of Spain, and that's what we're based on.
I am joined now by Kristen Barker, who is the local director of the Cincinnati Union Co-op Initiative. Kristen, welcome to Newsmakers.
Thanks for having me.
This is kind of an interesting experiment. The idea that the U.S. Steelworkers came to an agreement with this organization in Spain. Is the co-ops in Spain, Mondragon, was this something that you already knew about?
It was something I knew about because I've worked for the last 12 years at the Intercommunity Justice and Peace Center, and we had actually had delegations going there in the 80s and 90s to see what an exciting model it was.
And it's not just in Cincinnati that this effort through the unions is taking place.
No, but we are the prototype for this effort at this time. It's a nationwide effort, so when they made this agreement, it was to launch union co-ops around the country. But we got together to try to bring the energy here, and we became a pilot project. And then just a month ago, I was actually hired by Mondragon USA to help promote the effort.
So is that what it's called, Mondragon USA? Mm-hmm. So, okay, so it's a local in-country corporation. And we focused, because there was a video available about our harvest.
Yeah.
But this is only one of a number of initiatives you've got going, right?
Yes. That is the initiative that's been operating for the last year and a half, but there are 4 others that are about to be launched.
What are some of those? What do they focus on?
Well, one is would be bringing advanced manufacturing, another advanced manufacturing back into Cincinnati. One is related to being a construction contractor for energy retrofits. Mm-hmm. One is related to jewelry making, and one is baking and distributing a really innovative kind of cookie.
And that's being called?
The Yucky Cookie.
The Yucky Cookie, yeah. I couldn't pass that up. But how many worker owners do you have in Our Harvest project, which is, you say, has been operating now for a year and a half?
Right. So we have 9 at this moment, but our 4-year business plan shows us having 200 at that time.
Okay.
So there's really a lot of jobs available, and then out from there it becomes even more.
And what can a person who is a worker owner expect in terms of income? I mean, because that's the goal here,
right,
is to recreate solid middle-class incomes.
That's right. So it varies by industry, but in our Harvest model, it starts at $10 an hour, and the highest paid worker is getting $26 an hour. Then they have benefits as well. And to the best of our ability, we'd like to continue raising that. It's a tough margin in the food industry, but we really want to see what we can do in innovative ways to make it better.
So what's the role of the union and the American union model, which isn't a European union model? What's the role of the union here?
Well, the role of the union is, after the 57 years of experience in Mondragon, they realized that having one worker, one vote wasn't enough, actually, to have to have things work as best as possible within the co-ops. So they developed something called a social council, which is the place that is really for the workers, to kind of advocate on themselves on behalf of workers, and make sure they have continuous input, or more input, into the day-to-day operatings of the co-op. And it's a defined structure and process to increase input over the important things and to handle all of the challenges and conflicts that naturally arise, which is what a union does here.
Would a worker owner be a member of the union?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, they'd be union members.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Which is interesting, because in the American model, there's this split between the owners and the unions, and here you've got this combination.
It's an exciting partnership to change it all around.
This isn't unlike some of the things that are happening, and maybe not connected to Mondragon, but in Cleveland, with the Evergreen Cooperative,
Absolutely.
right? And you were mentioning the technology construction company. That's one of their 3 initiatives.
It is. They have yes, it absolutely is. They've been installing solar panels, but they were also inspired by Mondragon, and we've been in close contact with them because it's an exciting model and been underway since 2009.
And have you been up there to visit? Because they've just opened
a Green City Growers.
A Green City Growers, yeah. There's a lot of interest locally with that. Is that something? Is that something you could imagine taking on?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they were inspired by, but they're not under this same contract with Mondragon.
That's right. They were inspired by and had some technical assistance from Mondragon, but they're not part of the union co-op template. Okay. Pittsburgh is another pilot city for that, and they are having a clean and green laundry, actually 4 times the size of the one in Cleveland.
Really?
That will have 120 jobs when it opens next year.
Wow. I want to make sure people know how to find more out about this and find out how to to get to you. And additional information about Cincinnati Union Co-op Initiative, check out the website, www.cincinnatiunioncoop.org, or email info@cincinnatiunioncoop.org. Or you can telephone 513-403-9963. Kristen, thanks for being here this morning. Thank you for bringing this sort of initiative. This is kind of fun to see a different alternative. So good luck with this. Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the men and the women working to shape our region for the future. Have a good week.